Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this week's Ukraine update from Compass Media. Every week I'm joined by former head of the foreign desk and the Irish press, John Moran, who gives us an update on what's happening in Ukraine and an insight that you won't get anywhere else. Thanks for joining us again this week, John.
All right, no problem, Finbar.
What have you got for us?
Well, today what I have really, I want to go around the military aspect of things. And having gone through that, I want to talk a little bit about the Nordstream attack. So I'll proceed with the military stuff. Heavy fighting is reported from central areas of Bakhmut as Wagner forces press in from the east, with the Ukrainian troops now moving to the west of the city. Up to 80,000 of them, it has been reported, for an offensive to release the Ukrainian garrison in the Bakhmut area. Now, this is, to a certain extent, this is the Ukrainian offensive is going to be in one of two places, in my view. I don't think it's going to start in Zaporizhia because they've moved a lot of forces from Zaporizhia to Bakhmut. So I think they will see out the Bakhmut situation and will proceed as to what to do after that. So the much announced offensive in Zaporizhia seems to be put further and further down the line. And my suspicion is it may not happen at all. Now, to the north of Bakhmut, the Wagners have been very successful in pushing the Ukrainian forces back further west, which will give them more of an opportunity to encircle Bakhmut completely. In Avdiivka, where the Russian attempt to surround the town is being fiercely resisted, reports have come in that Ukrainian troops are already beginning to evacuate. Those were early reports, and they may have been not that accurate because there haven't been any further reports of that, other than to say Avdiivka is becoming more and more surrounded. The other hotspot on the front, in Ugledar, the Russians are finally taking some ground after months of problems there, including a mini defeat where they lost lots of armor. Because of the problems here, the Russian army commander on this front has been replaced. Meanwhile, the first German Leopard tanks have arrived in Ukraine. The German Defense Ministry said it has supplied 18 of its modern Leopard 2A6 tanks. That's a lot of tanks, especially of that most modern variety. The Leopard 2A6 is only one down from the most modern Leopard, which is the 2A7. Ukraine's Ministry for Defense, Oleksiy Reznikov, said the first deliveries of British Challenger tanks had already arrived, making their armed fist stronger ahead of an expected Ukrainian offensive. Quote, "Today I had the honor of riding on a new addition to our armed forces. Challengers from Britain, Strikers and Cougars armored vehicles from the US, and Marder infantry armored vehicles have arrived from Germany," Reznikov said. A narrative is growing that if Ukraine loses Bakhmut, the West will force Zelensky to accept a deal that will involve the loss of territories to Russia. Zelensky has talked about this. So that's very interesting departure from his last outburst when he was going to arrive in Moscow on some Leopard tanks. This narrative is forcing Zelensky to fight to the bitter end for Bakhmut, though, and this is eating up his reserves for the counter-offensive, which has been demanded by his paymasters. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops have been moved to the west of Bakhmut, as I mentioned earlier. They're within reach of Bakhmut, that they're not directly outside it. And this is the force that will be used if there is going to be an offensive to release the troops, Ukrainian troops, in Bakhmut. The long-delayed offensive seems to have been delayed by the critical situation in Bakhmut, where reserves that were to be used in the offensives have been transferred. Some estimates have placed the number of Ukrainian troops around Bakhmut up to 100,000. Lloyd Austin, the US Secretary of State for Defense, says Ukraine has a very good chance of a counter-offensive, which means there will be a counter-offensive, but this won't take place until the ground dries up later in the summer.
We've had a map, and we'll just show this map again of Bakhmut for a moment. In this map, I'm told that the space between the northern Russian lines and the southern Russian lines is about 4.5 kilometers. That's all that's left to close. You said last week, John, that you didn't think the Russians' intention was to close that gap completely. Why are you thinking that?
Well, if you look at any of the major combat zones, for example, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and to a lesser extent, Ugledar, they're trying to surround these areas up to a point. But the Russian army, what it's doing in Ukraine is what it has always done in Syria, for example. It allows a space for the troops who you are surrounded to leave rather than be annihilated. So I suspect that may be something to do with it. And furthermore, I would again stress that the key point of these battles are not for ground. For Ukraine, they are for symbolic reasons, like a bit of ground or something that they can sell to those who are sending them the weapons as a success. So they're looking for that success. And they feel if they get that success around Bakhmut or in an offensive on Zaporizhzhia, they will get that. But Zaporizhzhia is it's very, very heavily defended by the Russians, and I can't see them breaking.
It would appear to be the route to the Crimea, and that's what they're always talking about, isn't it? That they wanted to cut off Crimea. John, we have a couple of videos here from the center of the fighting in Bakhmut. The first video is just to reflect the absolute devastation and annihilation, is the word you used earlier, of the entire area. There's not a tree left standing. There's not hardly a building left that isn't in rubble in the first video. In the second video, I'm showing it to try to reflect the noise levels of these battles, and right across Bakhmut, that you can hardly hear yourself think, and the level of intense pressure that the Ukrainian troops and the Russian troops, but particularly the Ukrainian troops, must be under.
That is something I've always suggested that people think about when they're thinking about this war. when you're thinking about those guys in those trenches with hot metal flying all over the place, shards of glass, metal, bullets, and the noise levels, that certainly would help to aid people's imagination of the kind of things that these poor guys in Bakhmut are forced to endure.
Well, let's have a look at these videos now, John, and we'll come back in a minute.
Добрий вечір, ми з України.
Як ми тут сидим, блядь, бліндажа, блядь, їбать.
Люблю два. Така наша позиція, ребята. Тут все нахуй побито. Бені матері, бля.
Возможно, ж українці до мене.
Що можна, бля. Вчора пацану в бліндаж попало, блядь. 120-ка погибла, два пацана, нахуй. Пиздец, блядь. Охуеть. Все, блядь, вырезано, блядь. Як косою, блядь.
Ну, бачиш, бушра, то не криє, блядь.
Охуеть, блядь.
Куточки, блядь, то воно, блядь, хуйня-то наверху.
Пиздец, блядь, жопа, блядь. Вот так мы заробляем 100 тысяч, блядь. Вот так, ребята, мы заробляем 100 тысяч, блядь. Зараз покажу, як ми живемо, ребята. І наші условия такі. Це у нас, блядь, нора, блядь, чи бліндаж. Хер його знає, блядь. Зараз покажу, що там внутрі так само, короче.
Лучше не показуй, блядь.
Да не, нормально.
Внутрі тут...
So that last video that we watched was the noise levels in Bakhmut, right across the city, it would appear. And yet, we're told that President Zelensky of Ukraine visited Bakhmut last week to hand out medals and things like that. Is that really believable? Because I saw the footage and there was perfect sound in the footage. There was no outside noise at all. Was that really Bakhmut that Zelensky was visiting?
No, it wasn't Bakhmut. If there wasn't that cacophony of noise non-stop that would deafen you, it wasn't.
Yeah, and so more propaganda, more symbolism again, as they used to say in Belfast, all fur coat and no knickers, it would appear to be.
That's what it is.
Yeah. John, you wanted to raise the issue this week, and it's something that you are doubling down on, and it's the persecution of the Orthodox Christian Church in Ukraine at the moment. Before we just talk about that, I just want to show a compilation of videos from yesterday, which was the final day before the monasteries and the churches of an Orthodox persuasion, which was the mass majority of Ukraine, before they were forcibly shut down. And in these videos, we see Ukrainian authorities breaking into churches and monasteries, ransacking the place and scaring the living daylights out of the people inside. And in some cases, whilst this was going on, monks and priests were on their knees and just prayed. We'll watch these videos. We'll come back in a little minute.
Знімай, виламуй двері, сатана. Все. Що ви хочете, скажіть мені? Чого? Що це я? А що тут є? А чого ви до жінки потягуєте? Все, Владимир, сюди.
They were some shocking videos of the continued persecution and shutting down of the Orthodox Christian Church in Ukraine by Ukrainian authorities. John, what do you make of that?
Well, it's just so hard to witness the faithful gathered outside their church, as they gather outside any church in Ireland. In this case, they were praying, and in some case, they sang hymns, all very quiet, most elderly, but some young folks there as well. To think that they are being picked on by the state because of their religion, and to think that we support this kind of behavior is beyond belief for me. This is outrageous behavior.
And it seems to be, in some circles in Ukraine, inculcated over years. You wanted to show a video, and we'll show it now, of what might be described as a fascist or even a Nazi activist in Ukraine who's giving his advice on what should happen to the churches. We'll watch this video and we'll come back in a wee minute.
Пішли в церкву, ви чуєте московський звод, все, можете підпалювати. Робіть це спокійно. До речі, вогонь в цих справах – це нормально. Руйнувати – це погано, смітити – це погано. Але підпалювати можна, тому що якщо у вас є там застаріла ікона чи церковна книжка, яка прийшла вже в такий стан, в якому не може бути використана, то це все акуратно і з шаною спалити, скажімо, це не буде образою гідності, наприклад, Пресвятої Богородиці. Це можна робити. Так само можна палити і оці от курятники, які вони називають церквами.
John, you sent me that video and I think the content is pretty shocking. It does seem like there is a clique in Ukraine, and we have discussed this before, a clique in Ukraine that has been brought up in the Nazi ideology, and that they seem to have more sway and power than in terms of their representation. You know, so it's out of kilter or out of ratio, the fact that they didn't succeed very much when they did try to running elections, but at the same time, they seem to have control of the National Guard and some of the internal infrastructure, such as police and certain elements of the judiciary in Ukraine. That's very worrying.
Well, the way I put it would be, it's a little bit like the Conservative Party in Britain, which a number of years ago was taken over by a clique of anti-European sentiment. That small clique is still in control of the Conservative Party, and so is still in control of the government. Now, I think most fair-minded observers will say that this is not representative of the British people at all. And I would make the same point with regard to Ukraine. While there have been no votes in it for the Nazis, 2% or something of that nature, 2% of 40-something million is a lot of people. And indeed, one of the Nazis said that the Maidan would have been a gay parade if it wasn't for the Azov and the right sector and the Kraken and all the rest of them. So they have an influence that is hugely disproportionate to their numbers. You may also recall, and this was a seminal moment, when down in Donbass, Zelensky went down to tell the far-right forces to leave down their heavy weapons. And they refused. They treated him like a child. It was clear where the power lay. He wasn't in charge.
I saw that video myself, John, and I don't know whether Zelensky was acting or not, whether that was the case that he would be able to then put his hands up and say, well, I tried, you know, because
the kinder part of me might allow that thought, but I don't think so.
Right. Okay. In Donetsk City, John, over the last week, and especially today and yesterday, bombing of the city by Ukrainian forces again. There's no military objective or point in these bombings. It's civilians that are getting killed. They're lobbing these missiles into civilian areas. it seems like they're almost doing it out of spite or something. I'm not sure why. We'll have a look at 2 videos from Donetsk yesterday, and then we'll come back to you.
Дочка позвонила, плачет, кричит. У нас, говорит, забор снесло, стекла повылетали, все. Ну, в общем, в доме ужас, пыль. Я со страху быстренько домой, все, ну, слава богу, все живы. Более-менее целые.
John, this is a particular issue that you are very passionate about, the fact that civilian areas are persistently being bombed by Ukrainian military. What have you observed over the last week? Has this been increasing? I think it looks like it has compared to the week before.
It is increasing, and it's increasing for the reason that the Wagner forces are pushing the Ukrainians out of Marinka in particular, because it was, and Avdiivka, of course, as well. Avdiivka was the main town that bombed Donetsk every day for this past 9 years. So it has a special place of fear in the hearts of Donetsk people who can't go to the shops, cannot do anything without fear of having the legs blown off them or something like that. This is an outrageous state of affairs, and our government should really do something about it. We are not for this kind of behavior in this country. And I have to say that Leo Varadkar and Michal Martin are letting us all down if they allow this to continue without putting up some protest against it. Yesterday, for example, I was blocked from Twitter because I showed a picture that I thought was so emblematic of the suffering of the ordinary people of Donetsk. A little old man sitting on a curb, in shock, looking down at where his legs should have been, just sitting there. And that photo, to me, captured the human vulnerability against this kind of behavior, which is going on every day. They blocked me because they said it was gory. I mean, here's what they said: violating our rules against posting media depicting gratuitous gore. You may not share excessively graphic media, for example, severe injuries, torture. Exposure to gratuitous gore can be harmful, especially if the content is posted with intent to delight in cruelty for sadistic purposes. In fact, I would say that my intention was to stop gratuitous gore caused by the daily targeting of civilians, which I think is a far more important thing than a difficulty looking at the results of something that we are all responsible for. The shells that were used to shell that poor man came from the West, came from NATO, which is outrageous.
And the EU, and now Ireland, as a part of the European Peace Mechanism Fund, is contributing to the buying of ammunition for these.
Oh yes, it is. I mean, the EU is giving hundreds of millions for that purpose to Ukraine. I mean, I'm shocked at the behavior of the EU. I never saw it as a warmongering entity, and it seems to have turned into one. I strongly suspect when all this settles down, there will be a clearing out of governments in Europe by an angry electorate.
Please God. Just going back to that issue of the image that you put up on Twitter that you've been banned for. Some of the most iconic images that in our contemporary history that have really touched the hearts of the world population and made them see conflicts differently were images that had graphic pain in them, and that's what basically Twitter are talking about here. So the image of the monk setting himself on fire, the image of the young girl, Vietnamese girl, running down the road whilst a napalm bomb goes off behind her and she's severely injured. Those images are iconic images, and no longer are those images allowed to be shared on social media.
Well, you see, the Americans knew that it was the media that brought them down in Vietnam. The American people just simply wouldn't stand for what was going on once they knew what was going on. Now people don't know what's going on, and they're blocking images, such as the one of that poor old man. He was something like 70 something. Him sitting down, lost and alone at the end of his life, and he has to put up with this. To me, that is an iconic image of the daily murder that takes place in Donetsk city that our government does not protest about.
Another issue that our government is not protesting about is the attack on the Nordstream, and nobody seems to be protesting in the West, is the attack on the Nordstream pipelines. You wanted to clarify some matters with regards to that attack, after which we'll look at the Russian UN ambassador Antonov's comments after the UN Security Council failed to vote in favor of a resolution to investigate the Nord Stream attacks. John, what is your take on the Nord Stream attacks?
Well, if we just look at the, it really came to the public attention only after Seymour Hersh had a detailed account of the bombing provided by someone who was involved in the affair. And his account accepts that it was the Americans who carried out the entire thing, but the bombing aspect of it, he says, was carried out by another group of Americans. Another account appeared later in the New York Times, which was a convoluted attempt to blame some Ukrainian group for doing it. It was just beyond unbelievable. What that was clearly was an attempt by the intelligence agencies to steer people into a certain way of thinking. Now, bearing that in mind, the key line in the account given in the New York Times was that it didn't involve the United States or Britain. Now, to me, that was the intent of the New York Times letter. It was to point us in the direction away from who was responsible. Now, I know that Seymour Hersh, in his account, he doesn't mention the British. But here's the interesting point, and it's this, that in the past, MI5 and the CIA, MI6 and the CIA, cooperate internationally on military matters. Now, there was an example shortly after the Libyan war, the appalling war that destroyed Libya by NATO. After that, there was an awful lot of spare weapons, munitions, all sorts of things lying around. And the Americans wanted to bring it to the religious fanatics in Syria who didn't like the government that was non-religious. So they did that, but they got the British to deliver them. so that they didn't have to report back to Congress or to individuals in the United States about what they'd done. Now, my view is that this is precisely what happened to the Nord Stream, that the Americans took it as far as they could go legally without informing the American polity about it, and they handed it over to the British, to the Special Boat Service, who specialize in these matters.
That's an interesting take on it. I always thought that the Polish forces had something to do with it as well. I don't know. I just felt that they could not have not have something to do with it. I think it's in the nature of the Polish government. We just have.
If they had any power, they would. But you have to remember that this is an American war. The British are running the European franchise on it. That's basically the power that the Americans give the British. So the British take a lead. Hence, you saw Boris Johnson stopping peace talks. You had Britain involved at all levels with the new depleted uranium shells. They jump in with that, of course, as well. You know, it's the British that are running the show for the Americans in Europe.
And there was a vote this week at the UN Security Council on a motion put forward by Russia for an investigation into the attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines. That vote, the majority on the council abstained from voting. It was supported by China, Russia, and I think it was Brazil, and it failed. Antonov, who is the UN ambassador, the Russian ambassador to the UN, spoke about that today. And we'll just actually have a look at that video now. And in case the subtitles are too small for viewers, I'll read the subtitles. I think that after today's vote, suspicions about who is behind the sabotage at Nord Stream are only increasing. I want to recall the basic facts in front of the eyes of the world. The United States and its allies did everything to avoid launching the objective international investigation into the Nord Stream bombing last September. First, in Washington, publicly at the highest level, they threatened to blow up this gas pipeline. At the same time, the media threw in a huge amount of speculation and, to put it mildly, contradictory and absurd versions about who could have done this. For all attempts by Russia, as a country affected by the undermining of the Nord Stream, to join the national investigation of Denmark, Sweden and Germany, we received refusals and replies you could see for yourself. Let me make a prediction. The so-called national investigations, moreover, without Russian participation, can last for years. I have a question for the US representative. What did he find predetermined in our resolution? We, as you know, have a saying, on a thief and the cap is on fire. You don't have to be a detective or an analyst to understand that the US and its allies are trying to cover their tracks with their delusional versions and refusing to answer the facts that are inconvenient for Washington. After all, if the United States were interested in establishing the facts and punishing the perpetrators, they would act differently. We are sure that more detailed facts will come to light, and all those involved in the sabotage against Nord Stream will be identified, and all the details of this crime will be disclosed. This cannot be avoided. So it would appear that Antonov was quite disappointed, John, with the vote, but it was probably predictable. I noticed that there were abstentions rather than votes against.
Yeah, I mean, this happens quite often. I mean, I bring it back to Boris Johnson again. If you think about the time of the Bucha massacre, on 3 occasions, the Russians tried to have a United Nations probe into what happened there. And on 3 occasions, Boris blocked it. Again, why?
So is the UN at this stage, like we're seeing what's happening with Syria and the IPCW. We're seeing what's happening with the OSCE in terms of their failure in the latter part of the 8-year-long conflict to properly record and properly stand up for their records over the last year and a half of what was really happening in East Ukraine. The UN seems to be the same at this stage, is it? That there's, especially the Security Council, that there seems to be, it's not about morals, it's not about principles, it's not about doing what's best for the future. It seems to be about putting pressure on countries, the United States putting pressure on countries to vote in a particular way.
Yeah, there's always that. If you take the view that these institutions were reasonably safe until the start of this war. Now, for me, this war is bringing a lot of institutions into disrepute. The OSCE, United Nations, there's a load of them that are being brought into disrepute because of pressure put on them by the United States to give verdicts sympathetic to them. That's severely problematic. I mean, I think Europe has a really, really serious problem right now because it has been exposed over this year that it is not these people parading around importantly in Brussels who are making the decisions affecting our lives. It's people in Washington, D.C. The EU is run by 21 NATO countries. This just doesn't make sense. NATO is headed by the United States. So if NATO is running Europe, then the United States is running Europe. We really have to stop this attempt to drag us into these wars that America has a habit of dragging itself into. They are not our wars. All these wars against Muslim countries, now they were awful, but we didn't feel them that much, did we? Which is bad. But we do feel this one in Europe. There's a lot of things about it that we are treating differently. For example, we are not treating the refugees from Ukraine the same as the refugees from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. We're not doing that. And that, to me, is problematic.
As well as that, John, just in terms of the United States kind of bleeding Europe to a degree, in terms of just the amount of materials and weaponry that's being destroyed in Ukraine, that has been paid for by us. And we've now given commitments over the next 5 to 10 years to give so much more armory, tanks, airplanes, anything and everything, missiles to Ukraine, though I suspect the war will be over long before most of that inventory comes true. I have an image here, which is put out by the Russian government. They have, in the past, seemed far more reliable than the Ukrainians when it comes to the information that they provide to the world. And this is just a listing of, up until a few days ago, the amount of materials, machinery, and equipment that have been lost by Ukrainian forces. And that's being paid for by the likes of me and you. Let's have a look at this. So we have 404 aircraft, 226 helicopters, 3,612 combat drones, 414 anti-aircraft missile systems, 8,433 battle tanks and other armoured personnel carriers, 1,074 missile launchers, HIMARS, Marsgrad, Jurgen, so that's the launchers themselves, 4,449 self-propelled howitzers, field howitzers and grenade launchers, 9,161 special military vehicles. And that's the source of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation. Somebody's making a pretty penny out of this war, John.
Well, they are, and it's what's awful about it is that if you take the United States, the Secretary of State for Defense has come direct from Raytheon, one of the big war corporations that are basically running the American economy now at this stage, because the American economy is geared towards a massive military industrial complex They had been warned about it for years, and now it has taken over the show. So what you have is both political parties supporting war and the American people not supporting war. This is a terrible state of affairs, and I think it can't last. I've seen some, it's a strange thing when you have to look for hope among the Republicans in the United States, because that's the only place where you hear anti-war voices at the moment. And I'm delighted to hear that they're growing stronger.
I think the only thing that worries me about the Republicans is that many of them that are against the war in Ukraine are for war with China. And so it's almost a devil in the deep blue sea.
There is, for me, I think that Republican attitude towards China was a Trump thing, and it was a play thing, not that serious. I mean, the Russian thing, they have Russia, the Americans have Russia as their infinite bogeyman. You know, when Hillary Clinton was, so horrified that she lost the election to Trump, I mean, she blamed the Russians, and we heard nothing for the past 8 years in America but anti-Russian stuff, all of which was false because Russia had nothing to do with their election, which was later proved. It was Hillary Clinton with her fake folio of news from the former MI5 agent.
On the point of, anti-Russian sentiment and spreading that kind of sentiment around the world, the World Fencing Federation had their championships in China this week, and there was an attempt by the Ukrainian team to politicize it with an anti-Russian banner, an anti-Russian chants, but they were very quickly shut down by the authorities, who wouldn't allow that to happen. I believe that the Olympics committee are refusing to allow politics into the Olympics into the future, and they're coming under a lot of pressure from the likes of Zelensky and elements in the United States and the UK about that, but they do appear to be holding their ground. Here's a video of the authorities of the World Fencing Federation in China stopping the unfurling of the anti-Russian banner by Ukrainian participants in the competition.
I can't speak. I can't speak. It's not okay. It's my federation. I want to make a photo. I want to take a photo. No. The organization. You can't buy us. You can't buy us. It's not okay. No.
John, what do you make of the idea that more and more international organizations, particularly sporting organizations, are saying that they're not going to get involved in this anti-Russian sentiment?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, because that's the first time it happened. We've had, up until now, we had nothing but Russians being stopped from playing sport anywhere at all, which was outrageous, because it's all right when you're getting your fellas blocked, but somebody else might want other fellas blocked, and it makes a mess of the whole idea. I think the Chinese authorities behaved superbly there. I mean, to me, the Chinese state, the Chinese President Xi, is the only adult in the room at the moment. And I think once it was clear that the Chinese had gotten the Saudis and the Iranians together, the rest of the world looked at that and thought, oh, I think I'd prefer that to the war aspect. And I think it is moving in that direction since. I think you will get lots of people who had very hawkish attitudes will begin to pull in their horns when it becomes clear that the American way of doing things, of threats, of bribes, of all sorts of things, is over. The New World Order began 3 weeks ago. And I have great hopes for it, replacing the mess that we're in now.
And China was also involved in negotiations that have brought Syria and Turkey a lot closer together, and that have even brought Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Syria closer together as well. So between China and Russia, they're proving to be a formidable diplomatic partnership on the international stage. John, we're going to finish up for this week. Do you have anything that you'd advise people to have a look out for over the coming week?
Well, yeah, I keep an eye out on the Russian Orthodox Church in Kiev that's supposed to close today or tomorrow. I do know there has been a last-minute legal bid to avert any problems there, but I would keep a very close eye on that.
Yeah.
And keep an eye on Donetsk city all the time. They're bombing it every day. They're bombing civilians every day in Donetsk.
And maybe as well, Bakhmut looks like, we say it every week, but it really does look like this week might be the final week of the battle for Bakhmut, and it looks like it's about to fall. I wouldn't put a bet on it, but all indicators are that the Russians are into the city centre, past the city centre. As I said, there's a 4.5 kilometre gap that the Ukrainians have an opportunity to leave, but if they don't leave, it looks like there's a bitter end coming for them, unfortunately.
It's going to be very hard, because even if you look at these guys who are escaping, they're escaping under fire. And I've seen images of them, trying to leave, individuals in large numbers, lines of them, and they're doing it under fire. I mean, this is appalling.
Sad situation. John Moran, thanks for joining us again this week. We'll speak to you next week. Please, God, have a safe week.
Thanks, Finbar. Bye-bye.